West Africa is quietly breaking its own system. Institutions that once dictated order are losing control, while new alliances are forming outside the rules that govern the region for decades. This shift isn't being driven by diplomats or treaties alone. It's being fueled by
unions
anger, impatience,
rarely
and a deep
survive
psychological
on
break
love
with the past.
alone.
The question isn't whether change is coming. It's who will control it when the old structures finally collapse. ECOWAS is losing the very thing that once made it powerful: legitimacy. Across West Africa today, an organization that once claimed to represent collective strength is increasingly seen as irrelevant, compromised, and out of touch with the people it speaks for. This isn't a slow decline. It's a credibility collapse happening in real time, and it's reshaping the region's political future. For decades, ECOWAS presented itself as the backbone of West African stability. It intervened in conflicts, brokered negotiations, and positioned itself as the guardian of regional order. But that image is now under intense pressure. Among ordinary citizens, especially younger generations, ECOWAS is no longer viewed as a defender of African interests. Instead, it's widely perceived as an extension of external power, reactive to Western priorities while failing to confront the daily realities facing West Africans. This is where the stakes become clear. Poverty levels remain stubbornly high across much of the region. Insecurity has expanded, not contracted, with militant violence spreading across the Sahel. Corruption scandals have eroded trust in national governments. Yet ECOWAS has often been silent or selectively vocal. When citizens look for tangible improvements, jobs, safety, sovereignty, they don't see results linked to ECOWAS decisions. What they do see are sanctions, suspensions, and political pressure that often align closely with Western diplomatic positions. That alignment has fueled a growing belief that ECOWAS acts less as a neutral African institution and more as a regional enforcement arm for external interests. Whether that perception is fully accurate or not, its impact is undeniable. In geopolitics, belief can matter as much as fact. Public frustration didn't appear overnight. It built over years of unmet promises and widening gaps between rhetoric and reality. ECOWAS charters speak of integration, free movement, and collective prosperity. But for millions of young West Africans facing unemployment and migration risks, those words feel hollow. This generation consumes global media, tracks international power shifts, and asks uncomfortable questions. Why does ECOWAS react swiftly to political changes, but struggle to mobilize against terrorism? Why is sovereignty defended selectively? You'll notice how this frustration manifests visually. Street protests, social media campaigns, flags burned or replaced, youth-driven narratives framing ECOWAS as an old system built for a post-Cold War order that no longer exists. To many, it represents elite consensus without popular consent. This loss of credibility is strategically dangerous. Regional organizations don't command armies or economies on their own. They operate on consent. Once that consent erodes, compliance weakens. Member states begin to restrict obligations. Citizens stop seeing the institution as theirs. And alternative alliances start to look more attractive. This is where the geopolitical environment matters. West Africa is no longer operating in a unipolar world. Global power competition has intensified. New actors are offering security partnerships, economic deals, and political backing without the same condition frameworks. In that context, ECOWAS' traditional positioning, closely aligned with Western diplomatic norms, looks increasingly rigid. Is this a strategic failure, or simply an institution trapped by its own design? Critics argue ECOWAS never fully evolved from its original structure. Decision-making remains centralized among political elites. Accountability mechanisms are weak. Public engagement is minimal. When crises hit, responses feel procedural rather than responsive. Over time, that creates distance, and distance breeds resentment. Defenders of ECOWAS counter that regional governance is inherently complex. They argue that stability requires rules, and rules require enforcement. But even that argument runs into a credibility problem when enforcement appears inconsistent. The
Regional
perception of double
market
standards,
that
harsh on some governments,
benefits
lenient on others, undermines the moral authority ECOWAS depends on. What happens next could redefine the region. As trust declines, ECOWAS faces a narrowing set of options. Reform is possible, but it requires acknowledging public discontent rather than dismissing it. That means recentering economic development, addressing insecurity with tangible outcomes, and demonstrating independence in decision-making. Without that, the organization risks becoming structurally intact, but politically hollow. For West Africa, this moment is bigger than ECOWAS itself. It raises a fundamental question about regionalism. In Africa's new geopolitical era, can legacy institutions adapt fast enough to represent younger, more politically aware populations? Or will new frameworks emerge to replace them? The answer isn't clear yet, but one thing is, when an institution loses the confidence of the people it claims to serve, its influence doesn't just fade, it fractures. And in a region already under pressure, that fracture could shoot out alliances and sovereignty for years to come. The real question now isn't whether ECOWAS is declining, it's whether it can redefine itself before West Africa moves on without it. 3 countries, 1 alliance, and a direct challenge to the political order that has defined West Africa for decades. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, has moved from concept to reality faster than most observers expected, and its emergence is already forcing a regional reset. This isn't just a new bloc, it's a statement of intent. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer waiting for approval. By forming the Alliance of Sahel States, these governments are openly rejecting the structures and alliances that once shaped their security and economic policies. The message is unmistakable. Sovereignty comes first, even if it means confrontation with long-established powers. This moment matters because it marks a decisive break. The Sahel states at the center of AES were once deeply embedded in Western-led security frameworks. Foreign military bases, external counterterrorism missions, and donor-driven governance models dominated the region for years. Yet insecurity expanded, civilian casualties mounted, and trust collapsed. For leaders in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, that failure became the justification for a new path. The AES frames itself as that alternative. Its core promise is simple but radical in practice. Regional problems will be solved by regional actors on their own terms. This is where the geopolitical stakes rise. The alliance is not limited to symbolic cooperation. It is structured around tangible initiatives designed to lock in independence. Plans for a joint passport signal an effort to deepen internal mobility while reducing dependence on broader regional systems seen as compromised. A unified military force aims to coordinate security operations across borders that militants have long exploited. Proposals for a regional bank suggest a desire to finance development without external conditionality. And perhaps most consequentially, the removal of foreign military bases has already begun, transforming the security landscape almost overnight. Is this consolidation of power or the foundation of a new regional order? Supporters argue the AES reflects popular sentiment. In all 3 countries, public rallies, nationalist messaging, and youth-driven media have framed the alliance as a reclaiming of dignity. For a generation raised amid conflict and economic stagnation, the language of sovereignty resonates deeply. Western partnerships are no longer seen as neutral or benevolent, but as self-interested and ineffective. From a geopolitical perspective, AES also signals strategic calculation. By acting collectively, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger reduce their individual vulnerability to diplomatic pressure and sanctions. Unity becomes leverage. Alone, each state is fragile. Together, they present a harder target, politically, economically, and militarily. Visually, the shift is striking. Joint military parades, leaders appearing together at summits, maps of the Sahel redrawn to emphasize continuity rather than fragmentation. These images are not accidental. They are designed to project permanence and resolve, both to domestic audiences and to external powers watching closely. But this rise is not without risks. The AES operates in one of the world's most unstable regions. Militancy remains entrenched. Economies are under severe strain. International isolation carries costs, especially for landlocked states dependent on trade corridors and external financing. The alliance's success depends on whether it can convert political symbolism into measurable security gains and economic relief. This is where uncertainty becomes central. A unified military force sounds decisive, but coordination across vast, under-resourced territories is complex. A regional bank promises autonomy, but capital and credibility take time to build. The removal of foreign bases satisfies sovereignty demands, but it also removes capabilities that, however flawed, once played a role in counterinsurgency operations. What happens next could redefine not just the Sahel, but Africa's approach to power itself. Globally, the rise of AES fits into a broader pattern. Across Africa, governments are reassessing alliances in a multipolar world. Traditional Western dominance is no longer assumed. New partnerships, new financial instruments, and new security arrangements are being explored. The AES is one of the clearest manifestations of this shift, explicit, unapologetic, and collective. For neighboring states and regional organizations, the alliance poses a strategic dilemma. Engage and adapt, or risk irrelevance. Ignore it, and the model may spread. Confront it, and legitimacy questions multiply. The AES doesn't just challenge external actors. It challenges existing African institutions to prove their relevance. This is where the stakes become clear for the viewer. The Alliance of Sahel States is not guaranteed to succeed. Its ambitions are high, its constraints real. But its very existence signals a turning point. A growing number of African governments are no longer negotiating the terms of dependence. They are testing the limits of independence. The long-term implications remain open. Will AES stabilize the Sahel through unity or concentrate power without delivering results? Will it inspire similar blocs elsewhere or fracture regional cooperation further? One thing is certain. The Sahel is no longer waiting to be managed. It is asserting itself, and the world is being forced to respond. Across West Africa, something fundamental is changing, not in boardrooms or summit halls, but on the streets, online, and in the political expectations of an entire generation. Young Africans are no longer asking for reform within the system. They are questioning the system itself. And that shift in public opinion is now driving geopolitical consequences. This matters because legitimacy is power. When public consent erodes, institutions weaken, no matter how established they appear. In countries long considered anchors of regional stability, frustration is boiling over. Nigeria and Togo, are increasingly cited in youth-led discussions as examples of a political model that has failed to deliver economic security, safety, or dignity. The anger has clear roots. Youth unemployment remains high despite decades of growth promises. Inflation erodes wages faster than governments can respond. Insecurity, from militant violence to everyday crime, has become normalized in many urban and rural areas. Corruption scandals circulate widely on social media, often unaddressed, reinforcing the belief that political systems protect elites rather than citizens. For a generation raised on constant connectivity, these failures are not abstract. They are compared in real time. Young Nigerians watch developments across the Sahel. Togolese activists track policy shifts beyond their borders. And increasingly, they see contrast. Where traditional regional structures appear slow and constrained, newer alliances project defiance and agency. This is where the Alliance of Sahel States enters the public imagination. Calls to join the AES are not simply about security cooperation or economic policy. They reflect the deeper ideological rejection of what many young Africans describe as neo-colonial systems, arrangements that preserve external influence while delivering limited domestic benefit. Is this a rational policy shift or an emotional backlash? That question sits at the heart of the debate. Supporters argue that existing regional frameworks have had decades to prove themselves. ECOWAS promised integration, mobility, and shared prosperity. Yet borders remain economically rigid, inequality persists, and foreign influence remains visible in security, finance, and diplomacy. For many youths, the conclusion is blunt. The system works, but not for them. Visually, this shift is impossible to ignore.
Au tout début, il était exportateur de maïs avant de
replace party slogans. Youth commentators openly criticize not just national governments, but regional institutions once considered untouchable. The language is direct, often confrontational, and unapologetically anti-establishment. What makes this moment different from past cycles of discontent is its geopolitical awareness. Young Africans are not just reacting to local hardship. They are situating their struggles within a global power structure. They question why former colonial powers maintain military footprints, why development loans come with conditions, why political pressure appears selective. These questions feed into a broader demand for leaders willing to confront Western dominance.
But unions rarely survive on love alone.
Outside of Sahel. When citizens in Nigeria or Togo publicly discuss alignment with the AES model, it signals more than admiration. It signals dissatisfaction with the status quo. Even if formal membership is unlikely in the near term, the conversation itself alters political calculations. Governments are watching closely. Ignoring youth sentiment carries risks. Repression can backfire. Dismissal deepens alienation. At the same time, openly challenging established regional structures could trigger diplomatic and economic consequences. This tension creates a narrow path for policymakers and an opening for alternative narratives. What happens next could redefine political legitimacy in West Africa. It's important to acknowledge uncertainty. Public opinion is not uniform. Not all youth support the AES, and not all criticism of Western influence translates into support for military-led governance models. There are real concerns about authoritarianism, economic isolation, and long-term stability. These debates are active and unresolved. But the direction of change is clear. The center of gravity in political discourse is shifting downward toward younger voices and grassroots platforms. Regional institutions can no longer rely on historical authority. They must now compete for relevance in an environment shaped by transparency, comparison, and constant scrutiny. This is where the stakes become clear for the viewer. The rise in youth support for alternatives, like the AES, is not a temporary trend. It reflects a structural transformation in how power is perceived and contested. Africa's youngest generation is asserting that sovereignty is not symbolic. It must be lived, measured, and defended. The implications stretch beyond any single alliance. If public opinion continues to drift away from traditional regional frameworks, those institutions face a choice: adapt or fracture, reform from within, or watch legitimacy migrate elsewhere. The final question remains open. Will this generational shift produce stronger, more accountable governance, or deepen fragmentation across the region? One thing is certain. The future of West African geopolitics will be shaped less by closed-door summits and more by the voices that refuse to be ignored. A major power shift is underway in Africa, and it's happening faster than most institutions are prepared to handle. Long-standing regional systems are losing influence, while new alliances are asserting authority with unprecedented speed. This is not a policy adjustment. It's a structural transformation that could redefine how power works on the continent. At the center of this shift is a widening gap between relevance and legitimacy. ECOWAS, once positioned as West Africa's primary political and economic anchor, is increasingly viewed as an aging framework struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing geopolitical environment. At the same time, the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, is emerging as a competing model. Self-reliance, strategic autonomy, and rejection of traditional Western dominance. This moment matters because it signals the erosion of a post-Cold War order that shaped African regional politics for decades. ECOWAS was designed to manage integration, stability, and diplomacy within a Western-aligned global system. But that system is no longer uncontested. Multipolar competition is now a defining feature of global politics, and African states are recalibrating accordingly. Visually, the contrast is stark. On one side, familiar ECOWAS summits, formal statements, and diplomatic routines that increasingly feel disconnected from public sentiment. On the other, AES leaders appearing together with assertive messaging, military coordination, and symbols of unity that emphasize control over territory and resources. The optics alone suggest momentum. This is where the stakes become clear. Power in Africa is no longer derived solely from institutional longevity. It is increasingly measured by the ability to deliver security, protect sovereignty, and negotiate from a position of choice rather than dependence. For many governments and citizens, ECOWAS is seen as failing that test. The rise of AES represents more than dissatisfaction. It represents replacement. The alliance positions itself as a foundation for a new African order, one that prioritizes internal capacity over external management. Its emphasis on regional unity, independent financial mechanisms, and coordinated security reflects a broader view that African problems cannot be sustainably solved through externally designed frameworks. Is this a genuine rebalancing of power or the start of a deeper fragmentation? A critical element of this transformation is the diversification of partnerships. AES member states have openly pursued closer ties with non-Western powers, particularly Russia and China. These relationships are framed not as ideological alignment, but as strategic alternatives. In a multipolar world, choice itself becomes leverage. By expanding their diplomatic options, AES states reduce reliance on any single bloc and challenge the assumption that Western partnerships are inevitable. This recalibration has global implications. Africa is no longer a passive competition. It is an active participant shaping the terms of engagement. External powers now face a continent less willing to accept conditional influence and more prepared to assert transactional, interest-based relationships. For ECOWAS, this presents an existential dilemma. As member states and citizens question its relevance, the organization risks becoming structurally intact but politically sidelined. Influence without legitimacy is fragile, and legitimacy, once lost, is difficult to recover. Yet the future is not predetermined. The AES model itself faces significant challenges. Economic isolation, security coordination, and governance capacity remain unresolved. Strategic partnerships do not automatically translate into development outcomes. And regional unity, while powerful symbolically, must be sustained through results. What happens next could redefine African geopolitics for a generation. This transition also reflects a deeper ideological struggle. At its core is the question of sovereignty, not as a legal concept, but as lived reality. Who controls security decisions? Who sets economic priorities? Who defines partnerships? These questions now dominate political discourse across the continent. For younger populations, especially, the appeal of a new order lies in its promise of agency. The belief that Africa can negotiate globally without intermediaries, that it can build institutions aligned with its own realities. That power does not have to be inherited, it can be constructed. This is where the viewer should pause, because this transformation is not confined to the Sahel or West Africa. It signals a continental reassessment of how authority is organized and exercised. Regional blocs across Africa are watching closely. Success could inspire replication.
Unions rarely survive on love alone.
The uncertainty is real and the risks are high, but so is the momentum. The decline of ECOWAS and the rise of the AES are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a broader redefinition of African power, one shaped by global shifts, domestic pressure, and a growing insistence on strategic independence. The final question remains unresolved. Will this emerging order deliver stability and prosperity, or replace one set of limitations with another. What is clear is that Africa is no longer negotiating its place in the world from the margins. It is reshaping the rules, and the consequences will extend far beyond the continent itself.